My name is Chris, and this story is about the night a simple prank turned into something dark and unforgettable. It started as a game between my friends and me. Sneak up to a random house, ring the doorbell, then run like hell before anyone saw us. We called it Ding Dong Ditch, and on most nights, it was just harmless fun. But that night, we chose the wrong house. The house was old, hidden in the shadow of tall, leafless trees that loomed over it like a horde of dark sentries. It looked abandoned. Peeling paint, boarded up windows, and a front porch that seemed to sag under the weight of age and neglect. For a house like that, we figured nobody would answer, so it was the perfect target. "Bet you won't," dared Matt, nudging me with a wicked grin. I shrugged, feigning indifference. "Watch me." I tiptoed up the cracked, creaking steps, my heart thundering in my chest, and pressed the doorbell. The ding echoed through the hollow walls, but then I heard something unexpected. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone waking from a long, restless slumber. Without waiting another second, I bolted, my feet pounding against the gravel path as I sprinted to the safety of the trees where my friends were waiting, stifling laughter. But as we laughed, a chill ran through me, and I glanced back at the house. The front door was wide open. I whispered, "Did you see that?" "See what?" said Mike, wiping tears from his eyes. "The door, it's open." I pointed, but none of them seemed concerned. "Whatever, man. Let's go to the next one," Matt said, already turning to leave. But I couldn't move. I felt like the house was watching me, staring right through me. Then the door creaked as a figure stepped into view, shadowed and hunched, barely visible in the dim light of the porch. I strained my eyes, trying to make out who or what it was. The figure raised a hand and beckoned. "Chris," it whispered, soft as dead leaves in the wind. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots as I tried to run. My friends laughed, thinking I was overacting, but their laughter died down as they saw the figure too. It hadn't moved. It just stood there, a hollow shell, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, watching, waiting. "Come back," it called, louder this time, a twisted grin spreading across its face. "You started the game, didn't you?" Without another word, we all broke into a full sprint, that leaving that house, that figure, and the whispers far behind. Or so we thought. For days after, the knocks began. At night, when I was alone, I'd hear it. 3 sharp raps on my bedroom door, on the front door, on the walls. Each time, I'd open it to find nothing. My friends said they heard it too, always at night. Then Mike went missing, followed by Matt. It's been 2 weeks now. I'm the last one. Every night, the knocking grows louder, closer, and tonight, there's a note pinned to my door. It's your turn.
My name is Danny, and I still can't shake the memory of that night and the van that almost became my grave. It was a quiet, foggy evening, and I was walking home after staying late at my friend's house. The streets were empty, shrouded in that eerie silence that only happens at night. That's when I noticed it. A white van parked across the street, its headlights dim but on, almost like it was watching me. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but as I walked past, the van's engine started. I quickened my pace, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. The van matched my speed, creeping along the road at the same pace I was walking. I turned a corner, hoping it would keep going, but it followed, keeping a steady distance. My skin crawled. I could hear the faint hum of its engine behind me, almost like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. Then it pulled up beside me, and the passenger window slowly rolled down. I didn't want to look, but curiosity got the better of me. I stole a glance and saw a pale face staring back, expressionless, with eyes that were empty, black voids. I froze, unable to look away, feeling like those eyes were pulling me into darkness. A low voice, cold and hollow, whispered, "Get in, Danny." I had never told anyone my name. Panic surged through me, and I ran, my legs burning as I sprinted down the street. I could hear the van's tires screeching, gaining speed. But when I looked back, it was gone. Just like that, it had vanished, leaving only silence and the distant echo of my own heartbeat in the empty streets. Even now, I sometimes hear the hum of an engine at night, just outside my window. And every time I wonder if it's the van, waiting for me to finally get in.
My name is Sarah, and last summer, my friends and I decided to take a road trip to see the desert under a full moon. It was supposed to be thrilling, a spontaneous adventure to break up the ordinary. But somewhere along that lonely road, we stumbled into something we weren't meant to find. It was close to midnight when we saw the first sign. We were on a desolate highway, endless desert stretching into darkness on either side, when an old, weathered sign loomed in our headlights. "Don't stop! Keep driving!" My friends chuckled nervously, assuming it was some weird local joke, but something in my gut twisted. I couldn't explain it, but that sign didn't feel like a joke. As we kept driving, the night grew eerily silent. There were no other cars, no animals, just the low hum of our engine and an uncomfortable stillness that hung heavy in the air. Then we saw another sign. "It sees you." This time, nobody laughed. Emily, who was driving, tightened her grip on the wheel, her knuckles pale in the dim dashboard light. We exchanged uneasy glances, a mutual understanding passing between us. None of us liked this, but the road ahead was straight and empty, leading nowhere else. The next sign appeared sooner than the last. "It's closer than you think." My heart raced, and I couldn't stop myself from peering into the side mirror, expecting to see something. But the desert was dark, stretching out in endless shadows, and nothing seemed to be there. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, even though it had been off. A faint, garbled voice murmured, barely audible over static, "Sarah! Sarah!" I froze, my name sending icy fear down my spine. No one was supposed to know we were here. My friends stared at me, eyes wide and scared, wondering if they'd heard the same thing. And then the headlights hit something in the road ahead, a figure, pale and still, standing in the middle of the highway, face obscured by shadow. Emily slammed on the brakes and we skidded to a halt just feet away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, blocking our path, its head tilting slightly, as though watching us. Every instinct in my body screamed to turn around, but before I could say anything, the figure took a step forward. Then another, slow and deliberate. I couldn't look away, my heart racing as it got closer, and then I realized it wasn't human. Its eyes gleamed in the headlights, hollow and dark, a void pulling me in. I heard a whisper, faint and cold, drifting into my mind. "Sarah? You were warned." Emily threw the car in reverse and we sped backward, tires screeching. The figure faded into the darkness, but the signs didn't stop. They appeared every mile after that. "You can't escape, it's coming for you," until the words blurred into a frantic warning we couldn't escape. By sunrise, we finally found our way out of the desert, but I still feel its presence, that figure waiting in the shadows, biding its time. And every so often, late at night, I still hear my name whispered in static.
My name is Jamie, and I found the pencil in a dusty box at an old thrift shop. It didn't look special, just a plain, wooden pencil with a faint engraving along its side that read, "Draw your dreams." I thought it would be a neat little trinket for my sketchbook, so I bought it without a second thought. That night, I decided to test it out. As soon as I touched the pencil to paper, it glided effortlessly, smoother than any pencil I'd ever used. I sketched a small flower at first, and to my surprise, the drawing seemed to move. The petals swayed, and the leaves rustled as if caught in a gentle breeze. I blinked hard, thinking it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. The next day, I drew a bird. The moment I finished, it seemed to ruffle its feathers and take a tiny hop forward. Fascinated, I kept drawing trees, rivers, mountains, and each illustration came to life, right there on the page. It felt magical, like I had discovered some hidden power. I was so consumed with excitement that I didn't notice the fine, gray ash that started to coat my desk. Then I decided to draw a person. I sketched a girl I had a crush on, Katie. As I added the finishing details, her face on the paper turned towards me, her eyes blinking and her lips twitching as if trying to speak. It was then I noticed something strange. The pencil felt warm in my hand, almost pulsating. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed some line. As I lay in bed, the faint scratching of pencil on paper drifted through the quiet apartment. I went to my desk and saw, with horror, that the pencil was moving on its own. It was drawing. It sketched me. The version of me on the paper was different, twisted. The eyes were sunken, the mouth contorted into a scream. And then, it began to change. My hair fell out in clumps, my skin turned gray and cracked like old paint. I backed away, but the figure on the page seemed to follow me, its limbs stretching and twisting out of the paper. Desperate, I grabbed the eraser and scrubbed furiously at the drawing, but as I did, a searing pain shot through my body. I looked down and saw patches of my skin dissolving, just like the drawing. The more I erased, the worse it got. Now I sit in the dark, too afraid to touch the pencil again. The drawing still sits on my desk, watching me, and every time I glance at it, I see the changes on the page reflected on my own body. The ash continues to pile up around me, and I know, whatever magic is in that pencil, it's taking more than it gives.
My name is Jason, and I've been a postal worker for nearly a decade. I've seen some strange packages come and go, but last week was the first time I ever felt genuinely uneasy. It started when a small, plain box showed up at the sorting center with no return address. The only thing written on it was my own home address in shaky handwriting. Curiosity piqued, I took it home at the end of my shift. When I opened it, I found nothing but an old key. There was no note, no explanation, just a rusty, ancient-looking key that seemed out of place. I kept it on my kitchen counter, intending to figure it out later, but strange things started happening almost immediately. That night, I heard footsteps outside my front door. When I peeked through the window, no one was there, just a lingering shadow that seemed to shift and change shape in the streetlights. The next day, a letter arrived, unmarked and yellowed with age. Inside was a piece of paper with a simple message: "It's coming." You opened the door. I didn't understand what it meant, but a sense of dread began to creep over me. The following nights were worse. Every time I lay down to sleep, I heard whispers coming from the direction of the key, like a faint voice murmuring just out of reach. My dreams became nightmares filled with dark hallways and locked doors, with the sound of scratching on the other side. 2 days ago, another package arrived, identical to the first. This time, when I opened it, I found an old, leather-bound book with a lock clasped shut. The key fit perfectly, but something in me screamed not to open it. I decided to leave the book unopened on the table and went to bed, hoping this nightmare would end. At exactly midnight, I woke up to a loud bang, like a door slamming open. I rushed to the living room and found the book lying on the floor, open. Pages fluttered as if blown by an unseen wind, and a foul, cold air filled the room. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move closer, reaching for me. Terrified, I grabbed the book and threw it outside, but as soon as it hit the ground, the whispers stopped. There was silence, until a knock came at my door. I opened it to find a single letter on the welcome mat, addressed to me in that same shaky handwriting. Inside was one word: return. Now, the packages keep coming, no matter what I do. And the whispers have started again, closer and louder every night. I'm beginning to think there's no way to make it stop. Whatever I opened is here now, and it's not leaving.
My friends and I had always talked about exploring the old industrial plant at the edge of town. It had been abandoned for years, a hulking mass of rusted metal and shattered windows, and every local kid had heard stories about the strange things that happened there. Some said the place was haunted, others whispered about dark rituals. We thought it was just an urban legend, until we decided to check it out. We sneaked through the gap in the fence one night, flashlights in hand, as the chilly autumn air wrapped around us. The plant loomed over us, a maze of twisted pipes and crumbling brick walls. Inside, everything was coated in dust and grime, the air heavy with the smell of decay. Our footsteps echoed through the empty halls, bouncing off the rusted machinery that had long since stopped working. We ventured deeper, our curiosity driving us to explore every corner. In one of the larger rooms, the ground was littered with tools and debris, but what caught our attention was a hatch set into the concrete floor. The metal was rusted, the lock long since broken. One of us, Alex, pulled the hatch open with a grating sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. A dark, winding staircase descended into the unknown, and against our better judgment, we began our descent. The air grew colder, and a strange, wet smell filled our noses. The only light came from our flashlights, which cast long shadows on the damp stone walls. At the bottom, we found a long corridor lined with heavy doors, some slightly ajar. The walls were stained with dark streaks that looked disturbingly like dried blood. We split up to look around, each of us nervously calling out what we found. One room was filled with old medical equipment, rusty scalpels, syringes, even an operating table covered in grime. Another was lined with cages, large enough to hold a person, though we didn't dare look inside them too closely. That's when we heard it, a distant metallic clang, followed by a scraping sound that seemed to come from the darkness ahead. We froze, our flashlights flickering as if they sensed the dread in the air. The noise grew louder, echoing through the corridor, and then we saw it, a figure, barely visible in the dim light, dragging something heavy behind it. We bolted for the stairs, but the figure was faster than it looked. I caught a glimpse of it as we ran, a gaunt, pale face with hollow eyes, its bony hand gripping a jagged piece of metal. We reached the top, slammed the hatch shut, and raced out of the plant without looking back. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the streetlights. Gasping for breath, we glanced back at the plant, half expecting to see the figure standing at the gate, watching us. But there was nothing. We never spoke about what we saw down there again, but every now and then, when I pass by the old industrial plant, I swear I can still hear the faint clang of metal and the echo of dragging footsteps coming from deep within.
I was always a fan of horror movies. The more twisted, the better. When I heard rumors about Terrifier 3, I couldn't resist buying a bootleg copy from a sketchy seller on the internet. The movie wasn't released yet, but the seller insisted he had an early version. It arrived in an unmarked DVD case with a handwritten label that simply said, Terrifier 3, Uncut. It was late when I decided to watch it, lights off, alone in my apartment. As soon as I hit play, I regretted it. The quality was poor, and the scenes were disjointed, different from the first two films. It was like watching footage not meant for the public, behind-the-scenes takes or something. But then, about 10 minutes in, the familiar sadistic clown appeared on the screen. His grin was even more unnerving than before, painted blood-red lips curling into a menacing smile. The strangest part was, it felt like he was looking right at me. I shook it off as good acting and moved closer to the screen, mesmerized by the grotesque visuals. As the movie progressed, it seemed to change, shift, almost like the scenes were unfolding in real time. My heart raced when the clown suddenly whispered my name, Alex. Chills ran down my spine. It must have been a coincidence. No one knew I had the movie, and there was no way it could be targeting me. I paused the film, staring at the screen, and that's when the lights in my apartment flickered. Ignoring the growing fear in my chest, I resumed the movie. The clown grinned wider, his eyes almost sparkling as they locked onto the camera. "See you soon, Alex," he said. The scene cut to a shaky handheld shot, a dark hallway that looked eerily similar to mine. The camera moved slowly down the hall, towards a door at the end. I felt sick when I realized it was my door. Panicked, I grabbed the remote and tried to turn it off, but nothing worked. The movie kept playing. In the film, the door creaked open, revealing my own living room, exactly as it was at that moment. I stumbled back, the remote slipping from my hand. That's when I heard it, a slow, deliberate knock on my front door. My breath hitched as I crept towards the door, barely able to muster the courage to look through the peephole. The hallway was dark, but a faint, familiar laugh echoed just beyond the door. I reached out to touch the handle when suddenly the TV blared static, and the screen showed a close-up of the clown's face, inches away from the camera. He raised a hand to his lips, shushing me, then whispered, "It's not just a movie, Alex." The knocking started again, louder this time. My heart pounded in my ears as I stood frozen in terror, unable to move or breathe. The last thing I remember was the door slowly opening on its own, and the screen cutting to black. This original story captures the unsettling feel of a horror movie encounter gone horribly wrong, inspired by the style of the Terrifier series while staying unique and fresh.
My name is Emily, and I've always been drawn to the eerie and unexplained. I grew up in a small town surrounded by dark forests and stories of strange happenings. But one incident stands out above all others. It began the day I moved into an old apartment downtown, a place with creaky floors and a reputation for unsettling events. The landlord had mentioned a peculiar history involving the previous tenants. None had stayed for long, and the reasons for leaving were always vague. I was intrigued rather than scared. The rent was cheap, and I had always wanted to live somewhere with a bit of character. The first few nights went smoothly, the usual noises of an old building settling. But then, things started to get strange. One night, I heard soft music playing faintly from somewhere in the apartment. It was an old tune, something from the 1940s, like the kind you'd hear on an ancient record player. I searched every room but found no source for the sound. As soon as I would get close to where it seemed loudest, it would drift away to another part of the apartment. It gave me the feeling of being toyed with, like some invisible force was playing a game. Over the next week, the disturbances grew worse. The music continued, sometimes louder, sometimes barely a whisper, but always present. Doors I had left open would slam shut when I wasn't looking, and I began finding objects moved from where I had left them. It wasn't just small things. Sometimes an entire chair would shift across the room overnight. Desperate for answers, I asked my landlord about the apartment's history. He seemed reluctant to speak, but eventually he mentioned a rumor. Decades ago, a young woman named Lillian lived there. She had been a jazz singer with dreams of making it big. One night, she was found dead in the apartment, a broken record player beside her. No one knew exactly what happened, but some claimed she had died under mysterious circumstances. The music, it was the same old jazz song that Lillian had once performed, and the closer I listened, the clearer the voice became. It was no longer just a record playing. I could hear the faint, sorrowful lyrics, and there was a desperation in them, like a plea for help. Then came the whispers. Late at night, I could hear a woman's voice murmuring just beyond the walls. "Find me," she'd say, her voice trembling with sadness. One night, as I lay in bed, the music began to blare louder than ever before. The apartment shook, and the whispers turned into desperate cries. The lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I stumbled toward the door, but it wouldn't open, no matter how hard I pulled. The music and cries reached a deafening crescendo, and then suddenly, everything went silent. When the lights came back on, I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, holding an old photograph I had never seen before. It was Lillian, dressed in a shimmering gown, staring right at me with eyes full of anguish. At the bottom, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "Help me find peace." That was my last night in the apartment. I moved out the next day, leaving behind whatever haunted secrets lingered there. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear faint jazz music drifting through the air, calling out to me from a place I dare not return.
I'd always thought my grandfather's stories about the magic shoes were just fairy tales. He'd kept them in a dusty old box in the attic, warning me never to touch them. But when he passed away, and I was left to sort through his things, curiosity got the better of me. The shoes were black leather, with a faint sheen and intricate patterns stitched into the sides. They looked old, but perfectly preserved. I didn't believe in magic, so I figured trying them on wouldn't hurt. As soon as I slipped my feet into them, a strange warmth spread through my legs, and I felt a sudden urge to go for a walk. The moment I stood up, the shoes took control. My feet moved on their own, dragging me out of the house and down the street. I couldn't stop. The shoes carried me forward, step by step. They led me to an old part of town I'd never visited before, the streets lined with boarded-up buildings and faded signs. I tried to pull the shoes off, but they wouldn't budge. It was like they were glued to my skin. Panic set in as my feet turned down a narrow alleyway. The deeper I went, the darker it became, the air growing thick with a foul stench. At the end of the alley, there was a small shop I'd never noticed before. The sign above the door read, "Cobblers and Curses." The shoes carried me inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. The room was dimly lit, and an old man stood behind the counter, his eyes dark and sunken. He smiled when he saw me struggling to move. "Ah, I see you found my little creations," he said, voice raspy. "Those shoes belong to a dancer who never left the stage until she wore them out." I begged him to help me to get the shoes off, but he just shook his head. "The shoes choose their owner," he said, "and they've chosen you." Suddenly, my legs started to dance. Not a graceful, elegant dance, but a frantic, jerking motion. My feet moved faster and faster, twisting and spinning in ways that felt like they were tearing me apart. I screamed for help, but the old man just watched with a twisted grin. "You can't stop until they wear out," he whispered. My body ached, my muscles screamed, but the shoes kept moving. I danced until my legs gave out, collapsing on the floor. But even then, my feet kept twitching, trying to continue the cursed dance. As I lay there, exhausted and broken, the shoes finally began to loosen, sliding off my feet on their own. The old man picked them up and placed them back in the box. "Next time, be careful what stories you choose not to believe," he said as I faded into darkness. When I woke up, I was back in my grandfather's attic, the dusty box still sitting there. But the shoes were gone, and my legs felt like they had been shattered. I never found the shop again, and I still hear the faint tapping of dance steps whenever I walk by an empty alley.
My name is Erica, and I've always loved perfume. I'd collect different scents, from fruity to floral, to match my mood or outfit. One day I found an odd little shop on the corner of my street that I'd never noticed before. The sign above the door read, "Magnetta's Curiosities." Intrigued, I wandered in, instantly drawn to a display of perfumes in elegant glass bottles. One, in particular, caught my eye, a sleek metallic bottle labelled Magnetique. Its dark liquid shimmered mysteriously. I sprayed a small amount on my wrist, and the scent was mesmerizing, like a blend of midnight roses and electric air after a storm. I didn't hesitate to buy it, excited to add something so unique to my collection. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with deep-set eyes, gave me a knowing smile as she wrapped it up. "Just a warning, dear," she said. "This perfume tends to attract things." I laughed off her odd remark and went home, eager to try it properly. That night, I dabbed some on my neck and wrists before heading out to meet friends. The scent was even more intoxicating than I remembered, wrapping around me like an invisible cloak. I felt confident, magnetic, as if people's eyes were naturally drawn to me. But then, as the night wore on, I noticed something strange. As I walked home, I could hear soft rustling and faint footsteps trailing behind me. I turned around, but the street was empty. I quickened my pace, but the sounds followed, growing louder, closer. It was as if something unseen was drawing nearer, pulled toward me by an invisible force. When I reached my apartment and locked the door, I exhaled with relief, thinking I had imagined it. But as I took off my coat, I noticed a metallic glint near my window. A cluster of small objects, coins, keys, nails, was stuck to the glass as if magnetized. Over the next few days, more things began to happen. Random objects, metallic or not, seemed to drift toward me. A paperclip flew across the room and clung to my hair. A stray nail from the street stuck to my shoe. Worse, I started feeling a weight in the air, like I was carrying something unseen on my back. The scent of Magnetique had become overwhelming, almost suffocating, and no matter how much I scrubbed, I couldn't get rid of it. It clung to my skin, stronger and stronger. One night, I felt a tug on my shirt and turned to see something that chilled me to the bone, a rusty old key floating in midair, moving closer as if drawn by the scent. It was followed by other objects, a jagged piece of metal, a weathered spoon, all drifting toward me in a slow, eerie dance. Panicked, I ran back to Magnetta's Curiosities, desperate to find out what was happening. The shop, however, was gone, no sign of the building ever having existed. In its place was an empty lot covered in overgrown weeds and rusty debris. And the perfume, no matter how much I washed, wouldn't fade. I could still smell it, metallic, dark, and stronger than ever. Now the objects have stopped drifting. They're clinging to me, as if I'm becoming part of a collection of discarded things. I can feel a weight pressing against my skin, pulling me down, as if I'm being drawn into something far darker and deeper than I ever imagined.
My name is Alex, and I've always been drawn to old places, especially the cinema where I practically grew up. The place had been closed for over a decade, ever since a string of strange events, the fire, the power outages, and even a missing person case. When I heard the old cinema was reopening for a one-night-only screening, I couldn't resist. I had to see it for myself. When I arrived, it was like stepping back in time. The same faded posters, the vintage popcorn machine, and even the red velvet seats seemed untouched. It was almost unsettling how familiar everything was, as if the years hadn't touched it at all. There was no staff around, just a sign that read, "Admit 1" over the entrance to the main theater. Inside, the air felt heavy, thick with a musty scent that clung to the walls. I took a seat near the middle, glancing around to find only a handful of other people scattered throughout the auditorium. The lights dimmed, and the projector flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The movie began with a shaky black and white scene of the very theater I was sitting in. The footage showed empty seats, much like the ones around me, but they looked different. I watched, transfixed, as the camera panned to the right, then to the left. It seemed to capture subtle movements, flashes of figures slipping in and out of the frame. It was as if the film was alive, capturing the theater in some parallel world. Then, suddenly, the screen went dark. A low hum filled the room, and a soft whispering seemed to come from the walls. I glanced at the exit, but the doorway was swallowed by darkness. The whispers grew louder, turning into voices that sounded panicked, desperate. The screen flickered back on, and there I was, sitting in the exact same seat, my terrified face staring back at me. I blinked, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The camera zoomed in on my expression, my eyes darting around as if searching for something. Then, without warning, a shadow appeared behind the on-screen version of me. A hand reached out and gripped my shoulder tightly, and I felt it. Cold fingers digging into my flesh. I whipped around, but the seat behind me was empty. Yet, I could still feel the icy pressure on my shoulder, as if the hand was still there. The film kept playing, showing me struggling, trying to escape the grip of an unseen force. I watched in horror as the shadow pulled me up from my seat and dragged me toward the screen. My own screams echoed in the theater. Desperate, I ran for the exit, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers followed me, growing into an unbearable chorus of moans and cries. Just as I reached the doors, I felt something yank me backward. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and when I looked up, I wasn't in the theater anymore. I was standing on the screen, trapped in that same grainy black and white film, with an audience of empty, dusty seats stretching out before me. I pounded on the screen, screaming for help, but the only sound was the distant whirring of the projector. And then the screen went dark again, leaving me in a silence so deep I could feel it pressing in from all sides. Now, I'm just another part of the film, endlessly replaying my struggle to escape for anyone foolish enough to sit down and watch.